Welcome to TechWire, a conversation about government, politics, and technology. My name is Christina Gagner, and today I'm joined by Dan Morris, the Director of Technology for Kovarus. Dan, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Christina. Glad to be here.
So today we're at a conference, the CIO Academy, and we're discussing trends, we're discussing the successes of the government IT movement, but there is still a gap. Can you speak a little bit from your experience about why that gap still exists and what can be done?
Well, there's some prolific gaps, actually. A lot of challenges. Whether it's private sector or public sector, we run into the same issues, and that is the relevance of IT in the organization. And more often than not, we're confounded with having to sell other aspects of the organization, how IT can effectively work for them as a service provider. More often than not, leadership and its respective subordinates are confounded with the challenge of having to do IT tasks and not being an enabler for the organization.
So how do you then bridge that gap? It sounds like a lot of times it's kind of a translation problem. It's IT and perhaps jargon, and then convincing people who don't understand that IT is so critical for infrastructure of why it's important.
Exactly, Christina. You hit it right on the nail. As communication is key, it is paramount. In an ideal world, we'd like to see a Rosetta Stone, if you will, of how to bring stakeholders within the organization together and try to get in the same vernacular. Oftentimes, we speak in a lot of terms of acronyms and IT jargon because it's what we're comfortable with. But we have to start thinking outside those boundaries as IT leaders and start thinking of what is relevant and what language can my directors and my business units pick up on that make us more relevant within the organization. IT does a great job often of delivering services, but a very poor job of how those services translate to value for the organization.
So we've been having a discussion today about, speaking of relevance, about digital trends, about what's happening now that's really interesting and then what's on the horizon. Can you share some of your expertise on what you see some of those trends being?
So it's multifold. All the way from what we see from the plumbing level, if you will, we see radical changes in the way that we deploy infrastructure. Processing, compute, virtualization, these elements that tie in and build the infrastructure out are growing, I'd say, geometrically. Typically, we see a 2 to 4-fold every 3 years. I would argue now we're seeing about a 10-fold in the deployment of hardware, software, infrastructure items. It's mind-blowing, quite frankly, and how to tie all these pieces and connect them together to optimize the environment is a challenge because the technology is changing so rapidly. So I'd say of the three things that we look at, that's number one. Number two, of course, it's an overused term, but cloud enablement and cloud strategy. It's a real game changer, the way we deploy applications. It's going to cause us and force us to work closer with the business units to optimize what they need for the end user experience. If you don't do that from a cloud enablement perspective, basically like any other IT project, it's not going to work well. And the third thing we look at is operational readiness, the way the techniques that we use to build an IT infrastructure out. A lot of the methodology has been in place for a long time, but it's exciting to actually see a lot of our consumers from the public sector as well as private sector actually look at IT service catalog, IT service management, and a lot of the utilities from a IT perspective, how to align itself better to the business.
Now, do you see this change in approach as a reflection of the changing government workforce? I mean, one of the issues we've been tackling today is that, as part of the workforce is retiring, we have this new cadre of leaders, IT leadership in government, and they're doing things a different way. They're more collaborative, they're more hands-on. What's your perspective on that?
Boy, that's a tough question. It's more cultural based. In many of the departments or agencies that I work with, I kind of look at the state of California as roughly 130 different departments and agencies. Some of them have really grasped onto the millennial concept of instant getification, if you will, of technology and how to align it better to the business. Some places are still doing what's true and tested in their environment from 5-10 years ago. But in order to really be effective and be a enhancer to the organization, we're going to have to get more nimble in our approaches when dealing with internal consumers as well as the constituents and public at large.
Well, Dan, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your expertise.
Well, thank you, Christina. I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you to our audience for once again joining us in a conversation about government, politics, and technology.